You don't become this way by choice. You become this way because you endured more than you were ever meant to carry alone. And now you're wondering why people react to you differently, or why you feel distant even when you're surrounded by others. In this video, you will learn how too much suffering quietly reshapes a person's behavior. You will begin to recognize patterns that once protected you, but now isolate you. And when you see these mechanisms clearly, something important inside you starts to shift. One of the first behaviors appears almost invisible. You stop asking for help, not because you don't need it, but because you learned that help never really came. Somewhere in your past, you reached out and were ignored, dismissed, or made to feel weak. So you adapted. You became self-reliant to the point of silence. When something hurts now, you say, "I'm fine," even when you're not. Imagine a person who is overwhelmed at work, exhausted, emotionally drained. But when someone asks how they are, they smile and say everything is under control. Inside, they are collapsing. That's why you feel alone even when people are around you. They don't see your pain because you trained them not to. And here you start to notice another detail. You become emotionally guarded. Not cold, careful. You learned that openness has a price. When you once trusted, it was used against you. When you once expressed emotions, they were minimized or mocked. So now you filter everything you say. You reveal just enough to function, never enough to be vulnerable. Think of someone in a relationship who listens deeply, supports others, but never shares what they truly feel. When asked about their inner world, they change the subject or make a joke. Because of this, people feel a distance they can't explain. And you feel unseen, even though you're right there. But this is only part of the picture. Another behavior emerges. You tolerate far more than you should. When suffering becomes familiar, unhealthy situations don't immediately register as wrong. You tell yourself, "It's not that bad," because you've survived worse. Disrespect, emotional neglect, imbalance, these feel normal to you. Picture someone staying in a relationship where their needs are constantly postponed. They wait, they understand, they forgive, again and again. Not because they are weak, but because endurance became their strength. That's why you feel unimportant. You taught others that your limits are flexible, even when they are breaking you. And then something more subtle appears. You become hyper-aware of other people's moods. You read the room instantly. You notice tone changes, pauses, micro-reactions. This didn't come from sensitivity, it came from survival. At some point, your emotional safety depended on predicting someone else's state. Imagine a person who constantly adjusts themselves to keep peace. They choose words carefully, soften opinions, suppress reactions, all to avoid conflict. Over time, you disappear behind this adaptation, and people stop respecting you, not because you lack value, but because you rarely assert it. The situation becomes more complicated when control enters the picture. People who have suffered too much often need control, not over others, but over outcomes. Uncertainty feels dangerous. When life once hurt you without warning, you learned to plan everything, anticipate everything, manage everything. Think of someone who struggles to relax, who overthinks decisions, who feels anxious when things are unpredictable. Even joy feels tense, because it could be taken away. That's why you feel constantly tired. You are carrying a level of vigilance most people never develop. And slowly, another behavior forms beneath all of this. You stop expecting good things. Not consciously, quietly. You lower your hopes to protect yourself from disappointment. You don't dream loudly anymore. You don't imagine too far ahead. Picture someone who brushes off compliments, who downplays achievements, who says, "It was nothing." They don't want to want more, because wanting once led to pain. Because of this, life feels smaller than it should, and you wonder why satisfaction never fully arrives. But notice something important. None of these behaviors mean there is something wrong with you. They mean something happened to you. These were intelligent responses to overwhelming experiences. They kept you functioning when you had no other choice, and yet, what once protected you may now be limiting you. Understanding this is not about blame, it's about awareness. Because when you start to see these patterns clearly, you stop judging yourself for them. And when self-judgment fades, something else becomes possible. This is not the end of the picture. There is one more behavior, the most misunderstood one, and it changes how people perceive you completely. When you're ready, say, continue. There is one behavior that confuses both you and the people around you. You appear strong, sometimes too strong, calm under pressure, rational when others panic. You don't dramatize, you don't complain, you don't break down in public. And people assume you are fine. They assume you don't need support. They assume you are emotionally invulnerable. But strength like this is often forged in pain, not confidence. That's why, when you finally need someone to notice, no one does. And this leads to another quiet pattern. You feel uncomfortable receiving care. When someone shows genuine interest, concern, or warmth, something inside you tightens. You may downplay it, deflect it, or feel suspicious of it. Not because you don't want closeness, but because closeness once came with conditions. Think of a moment when someone sincerely tries to help you, and your first instinct is to say, "It's okay, I'll handle it." Because deep down, relying on others still feels unsafe. But the situation becomes even more complex. You may develop a sharp inner critic. Not because you hate yourself, but because at some point, being hard on yourself felt necessary. Maybe it kept you disciplined. Maybe it helped you survive expectations that were never fair. Maybe it was the only way to stay ahead of criticism from others. Now that voice questions your worth, your decisions, your emotions. That's why you rarely feel proud of yourself, even when you should. And here is something people rarely talk about. You might feel emotionally disconnected at times. Not numb, distant. Like you're watching life instead of fully living it. This happens when your nervous system learned to shut down emotions to survive overwhelming experiences. Imagine being in a moment that should feel meaningful, a celebration, a relationship, an achievement, and feeling strangely detached. Because of this, you may wonder what's wrong with you. But nothing is broken. Your system simply learned to protect you by turning the volume down. And then there is the way you relate to pain, your own and others. People who have suffered deeply often minimize pain. They tell others to be strong, move on, or not overthink it. Not because they lack empathy, but because they had to do exactly that themselves. This can create distance in relationships. Others may feel misunderstood, and you may feel frustrated when emotions seem too much, including your own. That's why emotional closeness sometimes feels exhausting instead of nourishing. At some point, another realization quietly forms. You don't trust happiness to last. Even in good moments, part of you waits for the shift, the disappointment, the loss. You scan for signs that something will go wrong. This isn't pessimism, it's conditioning, and it keeps you from fully resting, even when life is calm. Now listen carefully. None of these behaviors mean you are damaged. They mean you adapted brilliantly to circumstances that required strength far beyond what should have been asked of you. But adaptation is not the same as identity. You are not your survival strategies. You are not your emotional armor. You are not the habits you developed when you had no other choice. The most important insight is this. You can't undo the past, but you can update the rules you live by now. The behaviors that once kept you safe don't all need to stay in control. Awareness is the first step toward choice. When you begin to notice these patterns without judging yourself, something changes. You stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start asking, "What did I learn, and do I still need it?" That question alone shifts power back into your hands. You don't need to become someone else. You don't need to erase what you've been through. You only need to recognize that survival is not the same as living. And when you truly understand this, your relationships change. Your boundaries become clearer. Your self-respect deepens. And for the first time, your strength starts working for you, not against you. You can't change what happened, but you can change how much space it still occupies in your present. That's where real healing begins.